In the heart of being vulnerable, as my good friend Joanne did this morning, I want to start by sharing a little bit about my hometown. Not Philadelphia, but Chester, PA, is the first city where William Penn actually stepped foot in the New World. Did you know that? It is also the city where Martin Luther King Jr. went to seminary. Yet Chester is seldom known for these historical facts. What Chester has become known for is its violence. The stigma associated with Chester became clear to me during my times visiting the city. When I would exit the rental car location in Philadelphia en route to Chester, the rental car agent would ask me where I was going. I would say, Chester. The agent's facial expression changed, and they began to give warnings of extreme caution. Whether or not the fear that emerged from this city was warranted, the city had gained quite a reputation. Another distinct instance that reveals the hopelessness that pervades the city is when I was in conversation with a young man, a friend, in his early 20s. We had grown up in Chester, but he was currently searching for another place to live, and he was sharing his fears concerning living in the city. When asked, well, what can help Chester? He responded, we have to drop a nook on it. Chester is my hometown. Outreach efforts in the city of Chester often refer specifically to countering the social toxins that try to rob youth of their future. Adolescent developmental scholar James Garbarino describes a socially toxic environment as one in which the social context where kids grow up can be poisonous to their very development. Poverty, economic pressures, family dysfunction, crime, violence, despair, and abuse are all forms of social toxins that have a direct impact on the health, education, and social environment of children, my cousins. They pollute youth's atmosphere and seek to demoralize families and their communities. And oftentimes, these social toxins do not work in isolation of one another. In 2016, Neighborhood Scout had attempted research on what had been named the murder capitals of America. And out of the 30 cities identified, Chester, which is a very small city, probably like a population similar to Marion, was ranked number 2, only behind East St. Louis, Illinois. And the reason why I say that is far too often individuals like these exchange human flourishing for human survival. In their immediate need, they are searching and seeking for someone to depend on. Immediate relief for them is not a talking matter. And so even as I acknowledge that I am in a place of privilege to even have a conversation about avoiding dependency, I cling to the understanding that anytime we talk about turning from something, it is because we turn to something. And I propose that avoiding dependency precipitates our pursuit of human flourishing. And to be honest, as I began to prepare, I realized that I had a little angst myself about talking about this topic of avoiding dependency. And Reverend Bo had given me the topic a while ago, probably back in March, but I waited to the end of my semester and I said, okay, let me start preparing. And I just felt so conflicted inside. And the reason why, when I began to ask God about what is this angst, what is this conflict that I feel inside me, I realized that about 20 years ago, I'm not going to tell you how old I was, my community would actually be the object of one's outreach efforts. The conversation would center on whether Chester had become too dependent on outside resources. What was home to me had become a project that needed to be fixed by outsiders who could afford to leave their communities and lend a helping hand until it required too much until people from Chester began to think they deserved it. A project that would suddenly be left alone and all former efforts would dissolve underneath the social toxins that were actively sent to kill, steal, and destroy the very future from the kids in that community, in my community. And so I have to be very honest and vulnerable that as I share, that this talk is, I hope, encouraging, but it may also be a bit challenging. I'm going to approach it from a more theoretical level and talk about this continuum. And we're going to start with dependency. So what is dependency? We've heard a lot about what dependency is. Toxic charity describes the process of dependency like this: give once and you elicit appreciation. Give twice and you create anticipation. Give 3 times and you create expectation. Give 4 times and it becomes entitlement. Give 5 times and you establish dependency. Mission Frontiers, a magazine on missions, refers to this as a dependency attitude. They started it and they should pay for it. If this doesn't work, it is really their problem. I deserve what I receive from the Mission Society. Our leaders are getting paid with foreign funding, and that should somehow trickle down to us. Why should we feel obligated to contribute? And we understand, even as my brother Alex discussed in his presentations, that dependency is never a long-term solution, although it does at times provide immediate relief. Dependency can develop with or without an authentic relationship with those we seek to serve. But I think what's so important to reiterate is dependency, as he said last night, is a vertical relationship that consists of unequal power relationship. To even have a conversation about dependency affirms that there is one party who is the dependent and another who is the giver. And I think about, even in the book of James, like this idea of a patron-client relationship where good gifts flow from above. And the danger of this type of relationship is it reinforces what some scholars call the God complex that exists within a benefactor, while at the same time reinforcing the inferior complex that exists within the client. And so before I go any further to talk about dependency, I wanted you to just have some table talk. So oftentimes my context in outreach is not missions. It's not a global context. It's a local missions. It's a local community context. And oftentimes it's in situations steeped in poverty, like I showed you and opened up today. And so before moving on, I want you to just invite you to talk at your table. Why does poverty exist? So when you think about outreach efforts in impoverished communities, how would you define the cause of poverty? Why are people in cycles of poverty? I think it's really important to just take time to think about kind of like the causes, or how we even think about the causes of poverty, because whatever we think causes poverty will actually inform our approach to how we handle it. And so if we believe the primary cause of poverty is a lack of knowledge, then we'll primarily try to educate the poor. If we believe the primary cause of poverty is oppression by powerful people, then we will primarily try to work for social justice. If we believe the primary cause of poverty is the personal sins of the poor, then we will primarily try to evangelize and disciple the poor. If we believe the primary cause of poverty is a lack of material resources, then we will primarily try to give material resources to the poor. And so very much how we think the cause of poverty, how we think poverty emerges, really influences kind of how we respond to poverty. And it's really interesting in When Helping Hurts, How to Alleviate Poverty Without Hurting the Poor, authors Steve Corbett and Brian Fickert discovered something really fascinating. So they were doing research, and they were really interested in how is poverty defined? And they did a comparison between how poverty is defined in the North American context, particularly middle to upper class, predominantly white North American churches. And then they also did people who are in poor, low-income countries. And what was really interesting is in the North American context, when they described poverty, or when they talked about poverty, it really centered on the lack of material resources. But this won't be a surprise to you based on some of the other conversations. But people in the poor and low-income countries, they did mention a lack of material resources, but actually their focus was on shame, on powerlessness, on hopelessness, on inferiority, on depression, on isolation, on these more kind of psychological ways of inhabiting life. And so one of the things I want to say is to avoid dependency, we must do outreach holistically. That includes the psychological, emotional, spiritual, social, and physical needs of people. And this is really important because our ministry efforts this is really important because when the fall took place, the very image of God was distorted. And so even as we do our outreach, as if you read Walking with the Poor, it talks a lot about this, that part of our outreach efforts has to be about restoring the marred identity that both people who are poor, materially poor, and people who are materially non-poor have. One quote says it like this: "One of the biggest problems in many poverty alleviation efforts is that their design and implementation exasperates the poverty of being of the economically rich, their God complexes, and the poverty of being of the economically poor, their feelings of inferiority and shame." And so even as we seek to avoid dependency, one of the things I just want to emphasize is that we have to take a holistic approach. We have to also recognize that God is already at work in the communities we encounter, that our job is not necessarily to bring God to people, but to help them see where God is already moving amongst them. So this won't be a surprise to you either, is the independence, right? So as we've already stated, oftentimes we move from dependence to what do we people have to become? Independent. And it's a huge pendulum swing. And the solution to dependency, as has already been stated, is not independence. And this may be very challenging, but the ideal of independence is a very Western way of thinking. Sometimes we actually reinforce this idea that the only time one is supposed to be dependent is, at birth, when one is being weaned, off their mother's breast. But once they begin to walk, it's now time to be independent. You have to be an independent being. And one of the ideas or phrases that often kind of embodies this ideal around independence, which is a common phrase in American political discourse, is this pull yourself up by your bootstraps. It offers an image of the self-made man. And I purposely, of course, say man because very few women are imaged in this saying. And so I wanted to have a little bit of open conversation and ask you, what type of values do you think undergirds this idea of independence, this idea of pull yourself up by your bootstraps that is very common in American political discourse, and also, I would argue, very common in our churches as well. What type of values? Self-reliance, self-made, the American dream, which is if I work hard enough, right? Hard work. If I work hard enough, I can get it. I can flourish. Success, ideals of success that are measured by power. You're poor because you're lazy. Oh, yeah, absolutely. You're poor because you're lazy. Ryan? You're the inverse. You're rich because you're a good person, but you're poor because you're lazy. The idea that myth that there's equal opportunity for everybody. That's right. So the myth that there's equal opportunity for everybody. And so as we begin to think about, and these are just a few, what you named, as we begin to think about avoiding dependency and even how sometimes we go from dependency to you need to be independent, and how this idea of independence is actually embodied in some of the American ways of being, such as pull yourself up by your bootstrap. I want you to have some more table talk. I want you to talk about or respond to this question. Do you see any of these ideals manifested in the church's outreach efforts? If you do, what are some of the dangers of approaching communities, and particularly communities in poverty or communities at risk, and individuals with these ideas of bootstrapping, these bootstrapping ideas? What's the danger? And do you see this manifested? Maybe none of you see this manifested in your own outreach efforts. I don't know. But just spend about a couple minutes talking about that. So some would have us believe, though, that the ultimate goal of what it means to be a successful individual or organization, what it means to flourish, is about independence, that independence equals maturity, that the more independent we are, the more grown up we become. And while this type of ideal undergirds actually much of how we do education in Western society, and even how we measure the success of our own endeavors, I'm not sure if it's always the most biblical idea. But it is an ideal that we have exported, unfortunately, both within the U.S. and in a global context, that sometimes even these ideals become conflated with our Christianity. And it doesn't always do a good job of showing the world what it means to suffer with. And I may get in trouble here, but I would even say it can influence our theology. And I'm calling it bootstrap theology. But it really can focus on works and relying on one's own strength to flourish. I can achieve success based on my own strength. I can flourish if I just try hard enough. But guess what? If you can't pull yourself up by your bootstrap, you are lazy, so you should not eat. You are not working hard enough, so it makes sense why you are where you are. You are morally deficient. It even gets played out as if you can't be prosperous, you may not have enough faith. Or if you are suffering, you must deserve it. It must be your own fault. One meme I saw on the internet has a picture that says, can't pull yourself up by the bootstraps if you don't have any boots. And it's kind of funny because has anyone ever tried to pull themselves up by their bootstraps? I was doing some research and I discovered that, well, first of all, to pull yourself up by your bootstraps is actually physically impossible. But I also was doing some research, and the original meaning actually means to try to do something completely absurd. And so the way it's been used, and it seems like a transition, the first time you can kind of hear the transition is like in the 1920s. But the way initially was talked about, or initially coined, was really to talk about trying to do something absurd. It was meant to mean that it was impossible to do. But how we've talked about bootstrapping is often, once again, about being able to kind of, by sheer will and sheer force, being able to pull yourself out of this circumstance without actually having sometimes the support of others. And it was, and the reason why this ideal can become dangerous, Adam Gustine was at our church this weekend. He recently came out with a book called Becoming a Just Church, Cultivating Communities of God's Shalom. And he was sharing a story that just really stuck with me. He was sharing a story of how they had created this kind of like a food pantry, and people would come in and they would, really excited about the work they had done because they felt like it was a sense of dignity. People could come in, they could shop, and people, would do that often. But then he said one week someone from their own congregation actually lost their job and was too ashamed to go into the food pantry and shop. And so, once again, even though it seemed like this food pantry was creating a space of dignity, why is someone from their own congregation not wanting to go? And part of it is because how dependency is seen as morally deficient or covered in this kind of ideal of shame. But also what it points to is sometimes how this idea of dependency actually is a way to kind of categorize or kind of determine who is inferior or superior. Those people who need food are sometimes seen as inferior. And so while we are always moving away from an unhealthy sense of dependence, we must also acknowledge that learning how to be dependent in a healthy way is actually a first step toward interdependence. Oh yeah, I like what Martin Luther King Jr. said. Sorry, it's a little bit of a backtrack. He said, it is a cruel jest to say to a bootless man that he should lift himself up by his own bootstraps. It is even worse to tell a man to lift himself by his own bootstraps when somebody is standing on the boot. Martin Luther King. So the next part on the dependency continuum is this idea of codependency. So we don't quite want dependency, we don't quite want independence, and we definitely don't want codependency. So, and I think what's interesting about codependency is sometimes codependency actually can happen when you actually do have that relationship. A relationship has actually been established. But then what happens when the outreach efforts are codependent is sometimes the organization or people who are doing outreach begins to feel like it is their fault that people are in the situation they are in, that is their responsibility to fix it, that their efforts to help actually come from a place of compensating, and compensating to fix something they were never intended to fix. Sometimes it comes from a place of shame and sometimes guilt, rather than a place of love. And so in this sense, the very context from which the outreach efforts emerges is from a very unhealthy place, which ends up exhibiting unhealthy signs. And so many of you probably already know some of the signs of codependency, but some of the signs of codependency is emotion, depression, anxiety, stress. I don't know if you've been part of an organization that just feels anxious about communication with or the type of outreach efforts they're engaging. Sometimes a little bit of familial dysfunction. Other signs of codependency include having a hard time saying no, having poor boundaries, emotional reactivity, always feeling compelled to take care of people, a need for control, especially over others, sometimes trouble communicating honestly, fixating on mistakes, a need to be liked by everyone, a need to always be in relationship, denying one's own needs, thoughts, and feelings, And so some of these confusing love and pity, fear of abandonment, so all of these are ways in which sometimes our outreach efforts, us and individual outreach efforts with people or with organizations, can display these symptoms of codependency. And finally, what we were all waiting for, right? And so if we are not calling the communities and people we support to be independent or codependent or dependent, what are we calling them to? And you've already guessed. We're calling them to be interdependent. And one of the principles that has just always stuck with me throughout my life is this principle called Ubuntu. And it's a South African proverb that means I am because you are, or I am because we are. And the phrasing of I am is intricately connected to the existence and well-being of the you are. And so it means my humanity is bound up in yours. My flourishing is bound up in yours. And I think when we have that type of relationship that is a gift, Ecclesiastes 4:9-12 says, two are better than one because they have a good return for their labor. If either of them falls down, one can help the other up. But pity anyone who falls and has no one to help them up. Also, if two lie down together, they will keep warm. But how can one keep warm alone? Though one may be overpowered, two can defend themselves. A cord of 3 strands is not quickly broken. And oftentimes we use this for marriage when people are about to unite in that way. But this can also be used to think about interdependency and God's call for us to be interdependent upon one another. And it actually shows pity to the person who has no one to help lift them up when they are down. And I just believe that this idea of interdependence, as Dr. Jim Vermilya talked about, is a reflection of the community that is God, is mutual, is not unidirectional. And so how do we empower people while at the same time acknowledging our own need to be in community with those same people? And so I just want to give a few things about avoiding dependency. The first thing I want to say is to avoid dependency, we have to create solutions that are sustainable. And I'm not going to talk a lot about that because I know my sister, Reverend Joanne Lyons, will talk about that. But I do want to say something about redistribution, that the principle is articulated by John Perkins and Wayne Gordon in Making Neighborhoods Whole exemplifies, it's not a political idea of redistribution, but it's this idea that we are all, that what we have has been given to us, and that it's about sharing resources that have been given to us by God, and about a pursuit of justice that is actually motivated by love, not by obligation or not because, not by political party or anything like that, but is grounded in love. And so I know you have heard this phrase, feed a man a fish and he'll eat for a day, teach a man to fish and he'll eat for a lifetime. But in this book, Toxic Charity, Robert D. Lumpton poses the question, but what happens when the fish disappear from the lake due to pollution and overfishing? Then he writes, it's time for a change of strategy. Someone has to figure out how to get control of the lake, stop the pollutants, issue fishing license, put wildlife management policies in place. Teaching a man to fish is an individual matter, but gaining control of the lake is a community issue. And so this shift in strategy moves one from thinking simply about human survival and orients one to thinking about human flourishing. And so in order to avoid dependency, our efforts must extend beyond the here and now and think about future sustainability. And I think, to be quite frank, this is where it becomes a real challenge, because then we start to ask the question, who controls the lake? And whether or not those who are in control of the lake will actually share power. And so we might once again come upon this idea of what ownership is, what rights is, what my property is, and have to resist the ideal of independence for the ideal of redistribution. The other thing I want to say is to avoid dependency, I'm going to skip ahead. To avoid dependency, we must empower individuals and communities. And it's important for me to say that empowerment is more than a strategy to avoid dependency, but it is holistic. And the way Perkins defines empowerment is actually a releasing of the power of the Holy Spirit in individuals and their neighborhoods and communities, that this is the principle that serves as an antidote to dependency. And so ideals around empowerment is really about how do we release the Holy Spirit into spaces so that people feel empowered. And one example of this is when Peter, I don't know if y'all remember when Peter is walking and he goes past the gate, someone a beggar who can't walk is at the gate, and he asks for money, and he's looking and anticipating Peter giving him money, but Peter's response is, silver or gold I do not have, but what I do have I give you. In the name of Jesus of Christ of Nazareth, walk. And so in this moment, it's not money or finances or material things that's given, but it is the power of God. And Bryant Myers, in his book, Walking with the Poor, he talks about how often we kind of either do gospel as word or we do gospel as deed, but we don't always do gospel as sign, the miraculous, or kind of emphasizing the power of God. And I want to emphasize that as we think about avoiding dependency, that we can do everything we want materially or educationally or socially, and people still not know that it's the power of God at work in a situation. And so even to think about, so as we avoid dependency, is really important to keep in mind that to avoid dependency, we must actually embrace it. But that dependency is actually on God. And so, lastly, the Chinese proverb that is very well known that I really, really like is the best development is the type that when the development is done, the people say we did it ourselves. But I want to offer an alternative way of thinking about it, and that is the best development is the type that when the development is done, the people say, if it had not been for the Lord on my side, where would I be? And so this ideal of interdependence is an ideal where we partner with people and we are all looking to God for the results.